So I'm Joe Hubback. I work for a company called ISTARI. We're a cybersecurity company, and I'm the EMEA MD and also run our global academy where we work on cyber resilience leadership. But the thing I'm here to do today is to share the story of some independent research I did before I was with ISTARI, but I've carried on since joining ISTARI into cybersecurity technology efficacy and whether or not cybersecurity is really working. Now, the story starts a couple of years ago, and it started as a bit of a hobby project of mine between jobs. I was triggered by the difference in the way in which the private sector on one hand and then the secure government sector on the other hand buys cybersecurity. Observed that in the financial sector, in other commercial spaces, cybersecurity is bought based on some sense of functionalities or some, analyst report that says this is the hot new thing. Whereas cybersecurity in the government sector and secure government especially is bought based on whether or not it really works. And so an RFP from the government will have a clear definition of security requirements and the levels of security required and the efficacy of the solution. Whereas the private sector is much more about, does it have this feature? Am I achieving compliance? And I was triggered by that difference and wanted to understand it. So what started as a hobby has turned into a 2-year-long and much bigger thing than I expected. So I started doing some interviews and trying to understand, why the different parties were behaving in this way and what was going on underneath this difference. And what started to emerge was something that helps explain why cybersecurity technology still has major challenges around efficacy, and how we have the situation where we're spending more and more money on cybersecurity every year, but we're still suffering more and more attacks every year. So what is one of the underlying issues in here? And what surfaced from the interviews I did was that more than 90% of the 100+ people I spoke to in the end had suffered real issues with the efficacy of security technologies they'd bought. Now, I started out thinking I might speak to 10 or 15 people, but this work just cascaded as I met more and more people. I spoke to CISOs, I spoke to CIOs, I spoke to company CEOs, I spoke to security vendors, technology vendors, regulators, assessment organizations. And everywhere I went, I was passed on to someone else who said, oh, you must talk to so-and-so, they've got a great perspective on this. And so in the end, I ended up speaking to more than 100 people and discovered that something that we may feel in our bones about the market and the problems we face with cybersecurity is a much more real and endemic problem around the efficacy of the solutions we're buying. So more than 90% of people had said they have a problem with efficacy. Now, two interesting things came out. Firstly, what do we mean by cybersecurity efficacy? And the cohort of people basically aligned on a general definition which says cybersecurity is effective if it does what it promises to do, it's operationally usable in an enterprise environment, so you don't need to be some kind of fighter pilot to fly it and make it work. It's got the quality in its security architecture and build that it's not full of vulnerabilities. And the security vendor themselves is secure and they don't create a vulnerability for the product. So that definition of efficacy of cybersecurity emerged. But the other thing that was really interesting was that the problem with cybersecurity technology isn't actually a limitation of technology. It's an economics problem. And that's why I titled the report, Cybersecurity Technology Efficacy, is cybersecurity the new market for lemons? Because this lack of efficacy is driven not by humans' inability to create secure technologies. It's driven by the market incentives between the vendors and the buyers and the information asymmetry that exists between the vendor and the buyer. The vendor has a lot more information than the buyer about the solutions they're buying. And that creates perverse incentives. That means that solutions come to the market which lack efficacy. Now, having spoken to so many people anonymously and confidentially, I picked up some really interesting sort of insights and findings. Now, unfortunately, and obviously I'm not going to name companies that people mentioned, but it was quite amusing the amount of times various big name brands were mentioned as having real issues with their efficacy. So it was really quite enlightening understanding this. Now, the challenge remains, how do you actually fix this efficacy problem? And so I published my report and thought, okay, well, I found this thing, I've confirmed what some people had talked about for years of the issues in the market, and now we have the evidence of the scale of the problem. But since I launched the report in October 2020, I've been really shocked by the reception it's had and the number of people that I've never met who come to me and say, "Oh, I read your report. It's bang on. It's exactly right. It's a fair representation of what's going on, and we need to solve this problem." I'm even lucky enough to have had great support from Professor Kieran Martin, ex-head of the UK MCSC, who's sort of bought into the concept and is working with me on trying to solve this problem. So, okay, the problem exists. We have, to some extent, a market for lemons. But how do we actually solve this? How do we correct that imbalance in incentives and the information asymmetry? So Kieran has since, together with me, written a kind of response to the report, which is calling for a safer cybersecurity charter, which is about creating transparency and leveling up that playing field between the buyer and the seller in cybersecurity, which would create the incentives to improve the efficacy of solutions in the market. I have to say, obviously, I work on the vendor side, so I'm the skeptic or the poacher turned gamekeeper. But my sense is that from the conversations I had with the security vendors, all of the leadership of security companies believe in what they're doing, and they all think it's the other companies who have the efficacy issues. So there is even a sense within the security market that we need to focus on the efficacy of our technology. And everybody feels a frustration about the amount that's being spent on marketing and sales that should be being spent on development and technology and improving the efficacy of solutions for everyone in the market. So in conclusion, having started out thinking I was going to do a sort of 4-week piece of hobby work, understanding what's this difference between the secure government environment where security is paramount versus the private sector where it's about compliance and achieving features and functions. It's resulted in a much bigger piece of work and many more interactions with interesting people in regulatory bodies around the world, in vendors, in buying organizations around the world. But the challenge remains, how do we actually fix this? And I'm looking for anybody who wants to collaborate and discuss and debate on how to improve this. And Kieran and I are pushing this charter, but we would value anybody's input into how we can help resolve this market for lemons issue, which we think is one of the underlying reasons that cybersecurity remains such a challenge. So please do feel free to reach out. The report is at debatesecurity.com, or you can look